Two friends once sat on the floor of a small apartment, staring at a board covered in letters. They weren't expecting anything serious. Just curiosity. Just a strange game to try late at night. So one of them asked the board a question. A question people usually joke about. How will I die? For a moment, nothing happened. Then the pointer moved, slowly, sliding across the letters like someone else was guiding it. The first words appeared. In a car. The two friends laughed. Then the pointer moved again. At night. Now the room was quiet. One final word appeared. Alone. They laughed again and ended the session. Because it sounded ridiculous. Like something out of a cheap horror movie. But 22 years later, that exact prediction would happen. Late at night, on an empty road, inside a car, completely alone. And when people later began investigating the story, they discovered something even stranger. Because before the prediction appeared, the board kept repeating the same name. A name that thousands of people around the world would later report seeing during their own sessions. Different houses, different cities, different people who had never met. 4 letters. Z-O. Z-O. Zozo. In 2007, a man lost his life in a car accident. It happened late at night, on an empty road, and he was completely alone. Years earlier, someone had asked a question during a late-night experiment. How will he die? The answer came almost instantly. In a car, at night, alone, at the time. It sounded like a bad joke. Later, it would become the most disturbing detail in the entire case, and it all started with something found buried under a house. In the early 1980s, Oklahoma City was a quiet place. Brick houses, dusty streets, and neighborhoods where everyone knew each other. For a teenager named Darren Evans, life was ordinary. School during the day, music with friends at night, and weekends spent at his girlfriend Brandy's house. Nothing about his life suggested he would one day become connected to one of the strangest paranormal cases on the internet. But one afternoon, something unusual happened. Workers were repairing plumbing beneath Brandy's house. While digging through the dirt under the foundation, one of them noticed something flat buried in the soil. At first, it looked like an old board, but when he pulled it out and wiped away the dirt, letters appeared across its surface. It was a Ouija board, old, dusty, and clearly not new. But the board wasn't the strangest part, because placed around it were 4 glass jars, each one positioned at the corners of the board. When Darren and Brandy looked inside, they froze. Inside each jar were the remains of a black bird. No one knew who put them there, and no one knew how long they had been buried beneath the house. At the time, the discovery felt strange, but not dangerous. Just an odd object hidden under an old house. Something kids might laugh about and forget. But Darren didn't forget, because the moment he touched the board, something about it felt different. He later described it as an instant connection. Not fear, not excitement, just a strange pull to try it. And like most teenagers, curiosity won. A few days later, Darren set the board on the floor of his room. The lights were dim. A few candles flickered nearby, and the small triangular pointer rested on the board. Darren had one goal in mind. He wanted to contact someone famous, the late AC/DC singer Bon Scott. For nearly 30 minutes, nothing happened. The room was silent. No movement, no answers. But Darren stayed patient. And then, something changed. The pointer moved. Slowly at first, barely noticeable. Then faster, sliding across the board, left to right, back and forth, again and again. At the time, Darren believed he had finally made contact with a spirit. But investigators who later studied the case would notice something else. The pointer wasn't answering questions. It was repeating something, over and over. The letters were simple. 2 characters, repeated endlessly. Zo, 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 Zozo. Darren suddenly felt uneasy. He quickly tried to end the session. He told the board goodbye. But before the pointer stopped moving, it spelled one final message. A message Darren would never forget. Because years later, events would unfold in a way that made those words impossible to ignore. And this was only the beginning of the Zozo case. Most strange experiences fade with time. People move on, memories blur, life continues. But in Darren Evans' case, the opposite happened. Because after that first session, the board didn't simply become a strange memory. It started appearing in his life again, and again. And the name it spelled that night would not go away. The first signs were subtle. A few nights after the session, Darren woke up suddenly. The room was dark, silent. But something felt wrong. He tried to move, and couldn't. His body refused to respond. His eyes were open, but his muscles felt frozen. Then he heard something. A faint whisper. Not a voice exactly. More like a sound moving just beyond understanding. It lasted only a few seconds. Then it stopped. Darren could move again. At the time, he brushed it off. Just a nightmare. But the nights that followed became worse. The same thing happened again and again. He would wake up unable to move, sometimes hearing soft tapping sounds, sometimes footsteps somewhere in the house, sometimes a low sound coming from inside the walls, and each time the experience ended the same way, suddenly, as if something had simply left. During the day, things seemed normal, but Darren began noticing something else. The board. The Ouija board he had wrapped in cloth and stored in his closet. Sometimes it wasn't there. He would open the closet, look on the shelf, and the board would be gone. Not moved. Gone. Then, days later, it would be back exactly where he left it. At first, Darren assumed someone in the house was moving it. But when he asked around, no one admitted touching it. Not Brandy. Not her mother. No one. Despite everything happening around him, Darren kept using the board. Partly out of curiosity, partly because he wanted answers, and partly because something about the sessions felt impossible to ignore. Whenever the pointer began to move, the atmosphere in the room changed. The air felt heavy. The room became unnaturally quiet. And almost every session followed the same pattern. The pointer would move slowly across the board, then faster, tracing the same path, back and forth, left to right, like a rainbow pattern across the letters. And then, the same name would appear, again and again. Zozo. Years later, paranormal investigators would call this movement pattern the rainbow effect. It appears in hundreds of reported sessions, and almost every time, the same name shows up. But Darren didn't know that yet. At the time, he believed he was simply talking to something curious, something playful, something that wanted attention. That assumption would turn out to be dangerously wrong. Because one night, during another session, Darren asked a simple question. "Who are you?" For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the pointer moved, slowly, letter by letter. Zozo. Then it stopped, and began spelling something else. A message. A message that made Darren's stomach drop. Because it wasn't friendly anymore, it wasn't playful, and it wasn't pretending to be anyone else. The board spelled a sentence, short, direct, and deeply unsettling. "I am coming for your soul." The pointer then shot suddenly across the board and flew off the table. Darren ran from the room, but the strangest part of the story hadn't happened yet. Because the next person who would sit at that board would ask a question that would later predict what would happen to him. By the mid-1980s, the board had become part of Darren's life. Sometimes weeks would pass without anything unusual. Then, suddenly, the sessions would start again. And every time the pointer moved across the letters, the same name returned: Zozo. At first, Darren thought it was just part of the game. But one night, his best friend decided to try the board himself. And that single decision would change everything. Darren's closest friend was a man named Randy. The two had known each other since high school. They shared the same music, the same interests, and the same fascination with the unexplained. One evening in 1985, Randy came over to Darren's apartment. The lights were low. Music played quietly in the background, and on the floor between them sat the board. Randy had a very specific idea. He wanted to contact someone famous, the former AC/DC singer Bon Scott. Randy had always admired him, and like many fans, he believed it would be incredible to ask a few questions. So they dimmed the lights, placed their fingers on the pointer, and waited. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, suddenly, the pointer moved. At first, the movement seemed random, small circles, slow shifts across the board. Then, the letters began forming words. Randy and Darren looked at each other. The answers were strange, but they sounded convincing. The entity responding used expressions associated with Australian slang, something that caught both of them off guard, because Bon Scott had been Australian. For a moment, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The session felt almost entertaining, like they were part of something unusual, but harmless. Then the board made a request. It asked for a cigarette. The message appeared slowly. "Light one!" Randy laughed. It sounded ridiculous, but he played along. He lit a cigarette and placed it inside the hole in the pointer. Then something strange happened. For several seconds, nothing. Then the glowing tip brightened, dimmed, brightened again. As if someone invisible was taking slow drags. The two men watched in silence, half amused, half uneasy. Then the pointer moved again. The mood in the room changed instantly. The movements became faster, more aggressive. The pointer slid across the letters with sudden force, spelling words neither of them expected. Randy. The two friends froze. Before either of them could react, the message continued. "Your soul will be mine." Then the pointer repeated the same letters again. Zo, Zo, Zozo. Randy wasn't the kind of person who scared easily. Instead of stopping the session, he leaned closer to the board and asked a question that seemed like a joke in the moment. But later, investigators would point to this exact moment as the most disturbing part of the entire story. Because Randy asked the board something very specific. He asked it how his life would end. For a few seconds, the pointer didn't move. Then it slowly began sliding across the board, letter by letter. The message formed clearly. In a car. The pointer paused, then moved again. At night. Another pause. One final word appeared. Alone. The room fell silent. At the time, the two friends laughed it off. But years later, that answer would become impossible to ignore. For years, Darren tried to convince himself the board meant nothing. Just coincidence. Just imagination. Just a strange night from the past. But in 2007, Randy lost his life in a car accident. Late at night. On a quiet road. Alone. And the moment Darren heard the news, one memory returned instantly. A dim room, a wooden board on the floor, and a message slowly forming under their fingers. In a car, at night, alone. For the first time, Darren began to wonder something he had tried to avoid for years. What if the board hadn't been guessing? And more importantly, what exactly had answered that night? By the early 2000s, Darren's curiosity had turned into an obsession. He began collecting stories from people who claimed to have experienced the same thing. Strange board sessions, unexplained responses, and again, the same name appearing. Zozo. Different cities, different people, different decades, but the same pattern. At the same time, Darren had moved with his family into a house in Oklahoma City. It was an ordinary place. Quiet street, 2 floors, a small basement. He lived there with his wife Kathleen and their young daughter. For a while, life felt normal. But Darren still had the board. And eventually, curiosity returned. One evening, after their daughter had fallen asleep upstairs, Darren placed the board on the table. Kathleen sat across from him. The house was completely quiet. No music, no television, just the faint sound of the clock on the wall. At first, nothing happened. The pointer stayed still. Minutes passed. Then suddenly, it moved. Slowly. Sliding across the board with a smooth, deliberate motion. Kathleen later said the moment it moved, something in the room changed. The air felt heavier, the silence deeper, like the entire house had suddenly started listening. Darren asked a question. No response. Then the pointer began moving again, back and forth across the letters. The same pattern Darren had seen years earlier. Left, right, left. Almost like a slow arc. And then the name appeared. Zozo. Zozo. Kathleen felt a chill run through her arms. Darren didn't say anything. He had seen this before. But what happened next was different. Because Darren's posture suddenly changed. His shoulders stiffened, his breathing slowed, and his eyes stopped blinking. Kathleen asked if he was okay. Darren didn't answer. He was staring directly at her, without speaking, without moving. For several seconds, the room remained completely silent. Then Darren smiled, but it didn't look like his normal smile. It was slow, unnatural, and completely out of place. Kathleen immediately moved the pointer and ended the session. The moment she did, Darren blinked, looked around, and asked a simple question. What happened? He didn't remember anything unusual, but that night would become the turning point for everything that followed. Over the next weeks, strange things began happening in the house. Small things at first. Soft knocking sounds late at night. Footsteps somewhere upstairs when everyone was downstairs. Occasional tapping sounds from inside the walls. Darren checked the pipes, the attic, the basement. Nothing explained the sounds. Then the noises began appearing at very specific times, usually after midnight, always when the house was quiet. Sometimes it sounded like someone walking slowly down the hallway. Other times it sounded like something moving across the floor in the room above them. Kathleen began sleeping with the hallway light on. Eventually, the family created a small bedroom upstairs they called their safe room. If the sound started, they would all gather there and wait until morning. For a while, that routine worked. Until one night when Darren woke suddenly. The house was silent, but something felt wrong. Not a sound, not movement. Just a deep feeling that something inside the house had changed. He stepped out into the hallway. The air felt unusually cold. Then he heard something. A faint sound near the staircase. He turned the corner and saw his daughter standing near the bottom of the stairs. But something about the moment didn't feel normal. She wasn't walking. She wasn't moving. She was slowly sliding backward into the darkness of the hallway, as if something unseen had gently guided her away. Darren froze for a split second, trying to understand what he was seeing. Then she disappeared from view. Darren ran toward the stairs, calling her name, checking every room. The hallway was empty. The living room was empty. The kitchen was empty. Then he heard it. A small voice, faint, muffled, calling for him from somewhere below, from the basement. Darren rushed to the basement door and grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't open. The door was locked, and the voice of his daughter was still coming from the other side. Darren pulled the basement door handle again. It didn't move. The door was locked from the inside, and yet his daughter's voice was still coming from below, soft, frightened, calling his name. For a moment, Darren froze, because one thought suddenly crossed his mind. There was no way his daughter could have gone down there. The door had been locked all night. So if she was in the basement, how did she get there? Adrenaline took over. Darren slammed his shoulder into the door. Once. Nothing. Again. The wood creaked, but held. From the other side, the voice continued. Dad. Faint. Muffled. Panicked. Kathleen ran into the hallway behind him, asking what was happening. Darren didn't answer. He stepped back and hit the door again. Harder. The frame cracked slightly. One more hit, and the door finally burst open. Darren rushed down the basement stairs 2 at a time. The room was dark, cold, almost unnaturally quiet. Then he saw her. His daughter was standing near the far wall of the basement, shaking, crying, but otherwise unharmed. Darren grabbed her immediately and carried her upstairs. Kathleen locked the bedroom door behind them. For the rest of the night, the entire family stayed in the same room. No one slept. And sometime around 3 a.m., the sounds in the house started again. Slow footsteps, moving across the upstairs hallway, back and forth, as if someone was walking in circles, listening, waiting. Within weeks, the family made a decision. They moved out of the house. Darren packed the board away and stopped using it completely. But the questions didn't leave him. If everything that happened was coincidence, why had the same name appeared so many times? Why had the same patterns appeared in different sessions? And why had the events surrounding what happened to Randy matched the message from the board so precisely? So Darren began documenting everything, every experience, every session, every message. In 2009, he posted his story online. And what happened next surprised him. Messages began arriving from strangers around the world, people from different countries, different ages, different backgrounds, and many of them described the exact same thing: a board session, a pointer moving strangely, and the same name appearing over and over again: Zozo. Some people described the pointer moving in the same rainbow pattern Darren had seen. Others said it moved in figure 8 shapes, but the message always looked familiar. Zozo. Different boards, different houses, different people. Yet somehow, the same response. Some of those people had never heard Darren's story before contacting him. They simply searched online trying to understand what had happened to them, and found his page. By the time Darren realized what was happening, he had collected hundreds of reports. Then, thousands. Stories spanning decades, all connected by the same 4 letters. But one detail in Darren's records stood out more than anything else. Many of the people who contacted him described something that happened after the session ended. Strange noises in their homes, objects slightly moved, a sense of being watched, and sometimes whispers late at night, almost like something had followed them home. Darren eventually stopped researching the phenomenon as intensely as he once had. Life moved forward. His family focused on normal routines again. The board stayed sealed away, and the house where everything happened was left behind. But even today, people still report the same name appearing during sessions. Different cities, different countries, different years. And yet, the message remains the same. Zozo. Maybe it's coincidence, maybe it's suggestion, or maybe something else entirely. But one fact continues to puzzle everyone who has studied the case. Thousands of people have asked the board a question, and something keeps answering.